They shaved her head to humiliate her, but when they walked into court the next morning, they realized she was the judge. Presiding over their case, the night air was heavy with the sound of sirens cutting through the streets of downtown Miami. It wasn't unusual in this city. Police cars rushing to calls, lights painting the buildings in urgent flashes of red and blue. But tonight those lights would soon illuminate a moment of cruelty that would come back to haunt the very men who turned them on. Judge Isabella Marquez had left the courthouse late. She wasn't wearing her robes anymore, only a dark blazer, jeans, and a scarf to keep away the September breeze. To anyone who passed her on the street, she looked like just another hard-working woman heading home after a long day. What no one saw was the folder tucked under her arm, filled with notes on a case she would preside over the next morning, a case involving allegations of police misconduct. As she walked past a corner store, 2 patrol officers were parked nearby. Officers Daniels and Cooper, both known for being aggressive in their methods, noticed her. To them, she wasn't a judge or a respected community leader. They saw only what their bias allowed them to see: a black Latina woman walking alone, someone they thought could be intimidated. "Hey, you!" Daniels barked as he stepped out of the cruiser. Isabella froze for a second, then turned calmly. "Yes, officer?" she said, her voice polite but steady. "Got some ID on you? You look suspicious out here." Her brow furrowed. Suspicious? She was a federal judge walking home from her chambers, but she didn't reveal that yet. Instead, she carefully handed them her license. Daniels glanced at it, then exchanged a smirk with Cooper. "Marquez, huh? You Dominican? Puerto Rican?" "Afro-Latina," Isabella replied, trying to keep the exchange civil. "Is there a problem?" The smirk faded into something harder, colder. Daniels didn't like her tone, didn't like that she wasn't lowering her head the way many others did when confronted. "Step over here," he ordered. She blinked. "Excuse me?" "Over here," Cooper repeated. "You're being detained." Her pulse quickened. She thought about revealing her position, dropping the truth right there and ending the charade. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the way they looked at her, as if she were less than human. Maybe it was the years of stories she had heard from defendants in her courtroom who spoke of mistreatment. She wanted to see exactly how far they would go, so she complied. Within minutes, they had her pressed against the hood of their cruiser. Pedestrians walked by, a few lifting their phones but too afraid to intervene. "You can't do this," Isabella said firmly, though she tried to keep calm. Daniels leaned close to her ear. "Lady, we can do whatever the hell we want." And then came the act that would shock her to her core. They shoved her into the back seat and drove not to a precinct, but to an abandoned building nearby that they sometimes used to teach lessons. Inside, under the flicker of a broken light, they forced her into a chair. "You think you're better than us, don't you?" Cooper sneered. "Walking around like you own the city." Before she could answer, Daniels produced a set of clippers. The buzzing filled the air and Isabella's heart pounded. "No," she whispered, realizing what they intended. "Don't you dare," but they did. Rough hands held her down as the clippers ran across her scalp. Locks of her thick, coiled black hair fell to the dusty floor. They mocked her as they worked, laughing about how maybe now she'll learn her place. By the time they were done, Isabella's once proud crown of hair was gone. Her head was raw, exposed, a cruel symbol of their dominance. She fought back tears, not because of vanity, but because of the humiliation. When they finally released her, they tossed her license back at her. "Now get out of here before we find something real to charge you with," Daniels spat. Isabella stumbled out into the night, holding her scarf tightly around her head. They thought they had broken her. They thought they had silenced her. But what they didn't know, what would become their greatest mistake, was that tomorrow morning, those same officers would walk into a courtroom for a disciplinary hearing. And sitting at the bench presiding over their case would be the very woman they had just humiliated. She was not broken. She was not silenced. She was Judge Isabella Marquez, and justice was about to have its day. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Miami's Central Courthouse, casting long shadows across the marble floor. The atmosphere buzzed with anticipation. This was no ordinary hearing. Today, the disciplinary board was set to review complaints filed against 2 officers, Daniels and Cooper. The allegations were serious: unlawful detainment, use of intimidation tactics, and repeated abuse of authority, the kind of case that could cost officers their badges, pensions, and futures. Still, the men walked into the courthouse with the same swagger they carried on the streets, convinced the system would protect them like it always had. They laughed under their breath as they spotted reporters gathering outside, scribbling notes and snapping photos. Daniels nudged Cooper. "Relax," he said. "You know how this goes. They'll slap us on the wrist, maybe suspend us for a week. Then we're back on the job." Cooper smirked. "Exactly. Judges eat out of the union's hand." What they didn't know, of course, was that today's judge wasn't just another name on the roster. Today's judge had a personal stake in the case. Judge Isabella Marquez stood in her chambers, staring at herself in the mirror. The sight still rattled her. Her hair, once a symbol of her heritage and identity, had been stripped away in one violent night. She ran a hand over her shaved scalp, her eyes steeling with determination. They thought they had taken something from her. They thought they had humiliated her into silence. But in reality, they had given her something far greater: purpose. She adjusted her robe, fastened her collar, and walked into the courtroom with her head held high. The hush that fell over the room as she entered was immediate, the kind of silence that only authority could command. "All rise," the bailiff announced. Everyone stood, including Daniels and Cooper. Their cocky smirks faltered the moment their eyes landed on her. The realization hit them like a thunderclap. "Holy!" Daniels muttered under his breath. Cooper's face drained of color. "That's her." Isabella took her seat, gaze steady, her voice clear and unwavering. "You may be seated." The officers shifted uncomfortably as the room settled. Their lawyer leaned in, whispering furiously, trying to make sense of what just happened. Daniels wiped sweat from his forehead. "This can't be happening," he hissed. "She can't preside over this. She..." But Isabella cut through the murmurs with a gavel strike. "Court is now in session." For a long moment, she allowed silence to stretch. She wanted them to feel it, the weight of the room, the weight of justice, the weight of her presence. Then she spoke. "Officers Daniels and Cooper, you stand before this court accused of misconduct, abuse of authority, and violation of civil rights. The charges against you are severe, and as fate would have it, I am the one presiding over your case." The officers shifted in their seats, visibly squirming. Their attorney shot up. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this is a conflict of interest." "Surely, given the circumstances." Isabella raised a hand. "Sit down, counsel. The conflict lies not in my position, but in your client's actions." The room went still again. Reporters leaned forward, pens scratching furiously, cameras flashing. This was bigger than anyone had imagined. Daniels stammered, his arrogance collapsing under the weight of truth. "Your Honor, we didn't know." "We didn't know who I was?" Isabella finished for him, her voice sharp but controlled. "And that justified your treatment of me? That justified detaining me without cause? That justified shaving my head as some form of humiliation?" The officer's silence was deafening. She leaned forward, eyes locked on them. "You see, gentlemen, this is precisely the problem. You act without accountability, assuming the people you target have no power, no voice, no means of fighting back. But today you are wrong, because today the very woman you tried to silence holds the gavel." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The reporters scribbled furiously. The bailiff's jaw tightened, as if barely able to contain his approval. For Daniels and Cooper, the realization sank in like a stone. They weren't walking out of this unscathed. Their attorney tried again, desperate to regain control. "Your Honor, I move for a recusal." "You are personally involved." Isabella's voice cut like steel. "Denied. I am personally involved because your clients placed me in that position. The law does not permit them to escape justice simply because their victim wears a robe." She paused, letting the words settle over the room. Then she added with quiet conviction, "Today this is not about me. This is about every person who stood in front of these men and felt powerless. Today their stories are heard." Daniel swallowed hard, his bravado shattered. Cooper looked down at the table, unable to meet her gaze. And for the first time in their careers, the two officers realized they weren't the ones in control. Isabella lifted her gavel once more. "Proceed with the opening statements." The hearing had begun, and justice had never felt so close. The courtroom settled into a tense rhythm, the sound of pens scratching against notepads and the quiet hum of cameras recording every second. The public benches were full. Activists, community leaders, even ordinary citizens who had come after reading headlines about the shocking turn of events. For years, whispers about officers Daniels and Cooper had circulated through Miami's neighborhoods. Stories of harassment, intimidation, and abuse of power lingered like smoke. Yet those stories had always been dismissed or buried under insufficient evidence. Today, however, Judge Isabella Marquez was determined that the truth would not only be heard, it would be seen. The prosecution's attorney, Ms. Johnson, rose from her seat carrying a folder stacked with documents and photographs. She was a sharp, relentless woman known for holding law enforcement accountable. And today, she seemed more prepared than ever. "Your Honor," Johnson began, "the case against officers Daniels and Cooper rests not just on testimony, but on a clear and disturbing pattern of misconduct. The state will show that what they did to you was not an isolated incident, but the culmination of years of unchecked behavior." The gallery leaned forward. Daniels clenched his jaw. Cooper's knee bounced nervously under the table. Johnson called her first witness, a young man named Carlos Rivera. He walked slowly to the stand, eyes darting nervously toward the officers. His hands trembled slightly as he was sworn in. "Mr. Rivera," Johnson said gently, "could you tell the court about your encounter with officers Daniels and Cooper?" Carlos swallowed. "Yes, about a year ago I was walking home from work. They stopped me, said I fit the description of a suspect. I tried to explain I had just finished a shift at the restaurant, but they didn't care. They pushed me against their car, searched me, called me names. One of them shaved off part of my beard with clippers they carried around. Said it would teach me a lesson." Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Isabella's face remained steady, though inside her stomach turned. The humiliation this young man endured mirrored her own. Johnson nodded. "Did you file a complaint?" "I did, but nothing happened. They said there wasn't enough evidence." Isabella made a note. Already a pattern was forming. Next came another witness, an older woman named Mrs. Alvarez, her silver hair tied back neatly. She leaned heavily on her cane as she made her way to the stand, but her voice carried strength. "They stopped me outside my church," she said, her accent thick but her words clear. "Accused me of stealing from the donation box. I've never stolen a thing in my life. When I protested, they grabbed my cane, threw it in the street, and laughed as I struggled to stand. I filed a complaint too. Nothing came of it. Reporters scribbled faster. Some shook their heads in disbelief. The gallery buzzed with outrage. Isabella tightened her grip on the gavel. "Order in the court," she commanded, and the noise subsided. One by one, more witnesses came forward. Each story carried the same themes: humiliation, intimidation, and silence from the system meant to protect them. Finally, Johnson presented video evidence, a shaky cell phone recording taken by a bystander months earlier. The footage showed Daniels and Cooper dragging a young man from his car, slamming him against the hood while mocking his accent. One of them pulled out clippers and shaved a stripe down the side of his head while the other laughed. The courtroom erupted. Gasps, cries, and even shouts of anger filled the air. Daniels slammed his fist against the table. "That's taken out of context," he shouted, face flushed. Isabella struck her gavel. "Order!" Her voice carried like thunder. "One more outburst, Officer Daniels, and you will be held in contempt." Daniels sank back into his chair, glaring but silent. When the video ended, Johnson turned toward the bench. "Your Honor, this pattern of behavior is undeniable. The very act they committed against you is one they've inflicted on others time and again. This is not enforcement of the law. This is abuse." Isabella's gaze shifted toward the defendants. For the first time, Cooper couldn't meet her eyes. Daniels looked cornered, his arrogance deflating under the weight of evidence. She leaned forward slightly, her voice measured but firm. "This court recognizes that what we've heard today is not a matter of misunderstanding or error in judgment. It is systemic abuse fueled by prejudice and enabled by silence." Her words cut through the air, heavy with finality. But then something unexpected happened. Cooper spoke. His voice cracked as he turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I never wanted to do any of it." Daniels made the calls. "He pressured me. Said if I didn't go along, I'd be labeled weak. I know it doesn't excuse it, but..." He trailed off, shame flooding his face. The courtroom buzzed again. Daniels whipped his head toward Cooper, eyes blazing. "Shut up, man," he hissed, but the damage was done. Cooper had cracked the shield of solidarity. Isabella studied him carefully. She didn't pity him, not yet, but she recognized the shift. Perhaps buried under years of arrogance, a fragment of conscience remained. Still, justice was not optional. "Officer Cooper," she said evenly, "your words may one day weigh in on sentencing, but today, this court is not concerned with excuses. It is concerned with accountability." The gavel struck again, and the case pressed forward. For Daniels and Cooper, the walls of protection they had always relied upon were collapsing, and for the first time the truth wasn't going back into the shadows. By the third day of testimony, the courtroom was overflowing. Reporters filled every available chair, cameras perched like vultures waiting for the next revelation. Community members lined the halls outside, chanting for justice, holding signs with messages like "No one is above the law" and "End police abuse now." For Isabella, presiding over the case had become both a test of endurance and a measure of her resolve. Each witness, each piece of evidence chipped away at her composure. Though her face remained calm and professional, the weight of every story pressed heavy on her heart. She had always known injustice lived in the system. What she hadn't expected was to see her own trauma mirrored back in so many lives. The defense had tried everything. They brought in fellow officers to vouch for Daniels and Cooper, painting them as dedicated public servants. They argued that the witnesses were exaggerating, that the video footage was taken out of context. At one point, they even tried to argue that shaving heads was a disciplinary tactic intended to deter gang activity. The gallery scoffed openly at that. Isabella silenced them with her gavel, but inwardly, she shared their disbelief. The breaking point came when the defense decided to put Daniels himself on the stand. He walked up with the same swagger he carried the first night he stopped Isabella. His jaw jutted forward, his eyes narrowed with defiance. He sat down, raised his right hand, and swore to tell the truth, a promise everyone in the room knew he had no intention of keeping. His lawyer began with softball questions. "Officer Daniels, how would you describe your service record?" "Impeccable," Daniels said without hesitation. "I've served this city for 15 years. Taken down dangerous criminals, protected innocent lives. My record speaks for itself. And these accusations against you, what do you say to them?" Daniels leaned forward, speaking loud enough for everyone to hear. "I say this is a witch hunt. People who don't like cops are trying to destroy us. They see two men who actually do their jobs and they spin lies. That's all this is." Murmurs spread across the gallery. Isabella held up her hand. "Order," the lawyer nodded. "And the incident involving Judge Marquez, what do you have to say about that?" Daniel smirked, looking directly at Isabella. "I didn't know she was a judge. If I had, none of this would have happened. Simple as that." The words hung in the air like poison. Isabella's eyes narrowed, though her voice remained steady. "So you admit that your behavior would have been different had you known my position?" Daniel shrugged. "Of course. A judge deserves respect, and the others?" Isabella pressed. "The young man you humiliated on the street? The elderly woman you mocked outside her church? The countless others who had no robe, no title, no power?" Daniel's smirk faltered for the briefest moment, but he doubled down. "They're nobodies. Half of them are probably lying. And if they weren't lying, then they probably did something to deserve it." The gallery exploded with outrage. Shouts rang out. "Shame! This is why we don't trust the police. Justice for Carlos." The bailiff barked for order, but the emotion in the room was impossible to contain. Isabella's gavel cracked like thunder. "Order in the court!" Slowly the voices quieted, though the anger remained palpable. Isabella turned her gaze back to Daniels, her eyes like steel. "Officer Daniels," she said, her voice cutting through the silence, "what you have just admitted is not only damning, it is revealing. You see no problem with your actions, not because you deny them, but because you believe your victims lacked worth. That belief is the rot at the core of your service, and it is exactly why you are here." Daniels opened his mouth to respond, but his own lawyer cut him off, sweating bullets. No further questions. When cross-examination came, Ms. Johnson rose with a quiet fury. "Officer Daniels," she began, "are you aware that law enforcement officers swear an oath to serve and protect all citizens, regardless of race, status, or identity?" Daniels shifted in his seat. "Of course. And yet you've admitted under oath that you would have treated Judge Marquez differently because of her position. That means you choose who deserves protection and who doesn't, is that correct?" Daniels hesitated, his eyes darting nervously. That's not what I meant. Johnson pressed harder. But that is what you said. And your actions, against Judge Marquez, against Mr. Rivera, against Mrs. Alvarez, prove it. Isn't it true that you used your badge not as a shield for the community, but as a weapon against those you saw as powerless? Daniel's silence was answer enough. The tension in the room was unbearable. Reporters' pens scratched frantically, recording every word. Johnson stepped back. No further questions, Your Honor. Isabella leaned forward, studying Daniels. He had entered this courtroom believing he could talk his way out, the way he always had. But now, stripped bare before the law, he looked smaller, diminished. Officer Daniels, she said softly but firmly, you have not only disgraced your badge, you have disgraced the very idea of justice. This court will remember your words when rendering its decision. He glared at her, but the fire in his eyes was hollow now. As Daniels was escorted back to the defense table, the shift in the courtroom was palpable. The swagger was gone. The shield of power that had once protected him was shattered. For Isabella, this was the breaking point, not just for the case, but for the system that had allowed men like him to thrive unchecked. Tomorrow, the verdict would come, and justice was ready to speak. The final day of the hearing dawned heavy with anticipation. Reporters crowded the courthouse steps before sunrise, their cameras trained on the entrance, their voices buzzing with speculation. Community members held signs demanding accountability. Families of past victims stood shoulder to shoulder, united by years of pain that had finally reached a boiling point. Inside, the air was thick with tension. Daniels and Cooper sat at the defense table, looking smaller than they ever had before. Daniels's defiance had melted into a bitter scowl, while Cooper stared at his hands, his shoulders slumped with shame. Their attorney shuffled papers aimlessly, as though even he knew the outcome was no longer in doubt. When Judge Isabella Marquez entered the courtroom, the room rose in solemn silence. Her shaved head, visible beneath her judicial cap, was no longer a mark of humiliation. It had become a symbol of resilience, proof that what was meant to break her had instead fortified her. "Please be seated," she said. Her voice steady and clear. The courtroom obeyed. Isabella took a moment to look around the room. She saw the victims in the gallery, Carlos Rivera, Mrs. Alvarez, and others whose courage had brought their stories into the light. She saw journalists ready to record history. And she saw Daniels and Cooper, the men who had once laughed as they stripped her of her dignity. It was time. This court has heard testimony, reviewed evidence, and weighed the actions of Officers Daniels and Cooper, Isabella began. What we have seen is not an isolated lapse in judgment. What we have seen is a deliberate pattern of abuse, carried out under the authority of the badge and aimed at those least able to defend themselves. Her gaze sharpened on the defendants. Officers Daniels and Cooper, the law entrusted you with power. But instead of serving, you humiliated. Instead of protecting, you terrorized. Instead of honoring your oath, you corrupted it. And then, when confronted with your actions, you mocked those you harmed by insisting their lives had no value unless they carried a title or wore a robe. Daniels shifted in his seat but said nothing. Cooper's eyes glistened with unshed tears. Justice is not blind to such corruption, Isabella continued, her voice rising with conviction. Justice demands accountability, and today justice will be served. She lifted a stack of papers, the official ruling. Officer Daniels, she said firmly, this court finds you guilty of gross misconduct, abuse of authority, and violation of civil rights. Effective immediately, you are stripped of your badge, your rank, and your pension. Furthermore, your actions rise to the level of criminal assault, and this court recommends immediate charges to the state attorney's office for prosecution. Daniel's face went pale. He slammed a hand on the table, muttering curses, but the bailiff stepped forward, looming over him until he fell silent. Isabella turned to the second officer. Officer Cooper, while this court acknowledges your late admission of guilt and your willingness to speak the truth, it does not erase the harm you participated in. You too are guilty of misconduct and abuse of authority. You are hereby dismissed from the force and barred from future employment in law enforcement. Your cooperation will be considered in the criminal proceedings that follow. Cooper lowered his head, shame radiating from his slumped frame. Unlike Daniels, he didn't argue. He simply whispered, "I'm sorry," though the words sounded too little, too late. The gallery erupted. Not in chaos this time, but in a collective cry of relief. Applause, cheers, even tears filled the room. Victims embraced one another. Reporters shouted questions into the air. For the first time in years, the people felt seen. Isabella struck her gavel, but she did not silence them. For a moment, she allowed the sound to wash over her. This wasn't disorder. It was healing. When the noise settled, she delivered her final words. This ruling is not just about two officers. It is about a system that for too long has allowed abuse to fester unchecked. Let this be a warning. The law belongs to the people, not to those who misuse it. And no one, not even those who wear the uniform, are above accountability. Her gavel fell one final time. Court is adjourned. The bailiffs moved quickly, escorting Daniels and Cooper out of the courtroom. Daniels fought, cursing and shouting about conspiracies, while Cooper walked quietly, eyes downcast. Outside, cameras flashed as the two disgraced officers were led through a sea of reporters. Inside, Isabella rose from her bench. She removed her cap, revealing her bare scalp once more. The gallery stood not because the court required it, but because respect demanded it. Carlos Rivera stepped forward, tears streaming down his face. "Thank you, Your Honor," he whispered. Mrs. Alvarez leaned on her cane and nodded. "God bless you, Judge Marquez. You gave us back our voices." Isabella smiled softly, her heart heavy but proud. She had not sought this fight, but it had found her, and she had answered. As she walked out of the courtroom, the chants outside grew louder. "Justice for all. No more abuse. Marquez for the people." The sun was bright as she stepped into the open air. For the first time since that night, she no longer pulled her scarf tightly around her head. She walked bare, unashamed. Her every step a declaration. They had tried to strip her dignity, but all they had done was make her stronger. And now, the whole world knew it.